In our house, the clock in the kitchen always ran 4 minutes fast. Not 3, not 5, exactly 4. It had a faded cream face and black metal hands that ticked in dry, precise rhythm, loud enough to fill the room before anyone spoke in the morning. The numbers looked like they'd been drawn by someone with very neat handwriting, the kind my father would have admired. I grew up with that sound, the steady pulse of it marking out the rhythm of breakfast, of school mornings, of life itself. But no one ever tried to fix it. When I was 7, I decided to help. I dragged a chair to the counter, climbed up, and opened the little plastic panel at the back. My father found me there, standing eye level with the clock, my small fingers turning the dial. He didn't yell. He just stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching. Then he crossed the room, lifted the clock gently from the wall, and adjusted it back to where it had always been 4 minutes fast. He rehung it, straightened it carefully, and said only, "Leave it." I never touched it again. For years, I didn't understand. It made us early for everything: school, church, the dentist, even dinner at my aunt's. When my friends' families were slipping into pews as the hymn began, we were already seated, coats off, hymnals open. When the school bell rang, I was already at my desk. I used to think my father was afraid of being late, but he never hurried. That was the strange part. We were always early, yet he never moved quickly. He never seemed pressed for time. We'd sit in the car, parked outside wherever we were going, him reading the paper while the engine ticked, both of us waiting for the clock in the car to catch up with the one in the kitchen. Mum didn't talk about it either. She cooked by that clock, baked pies by it, timed roasts and boiled eggs to its rhythm. When guests pointed out that it was off, she'd smile politely and say, "That's how he likes it." That was all anyone needed to know. Once, when I was older, I overheard her teasing him about it late one night. I heard her soft laugh and her voice drifting from the kitchen. "One day, you'll be early for your own funeral." He chuckled and said nothing, and the sound of their laughter faded into the ticking. When I moved into my own apartment, I bought a cheap round wall clock from the hardware store. It kept perfect time. Too perfect. I'd check it against my phone, against the stove, against my watch. Every one of them agreed, and somehow that felt wrong. I kept glancing up, expecting the hands to lie to me a little to give me a head start, the way my father's clock always had. But they never did. After a few weeks, I took it down. When I visited home, I noticed the clock again before anything else. Still ticking, still ahead, still quietly ruling the kitchen with its unbothered certainty. Without realizing it, I smiled. When Dad turned 70, I bought him a new clock, a handsome wooden one with a silent sweep. I thought he'd appreciate the upgrade. He ran his thumb along the edge, admired the design, and said, "It's a good clock." Then, after a pause, he added, "But it doesn't sound like anything." The new one went back in its box. The old one stayed on the wall. I stopped questioning it after that. Eventually, I caught myself showing up early to things: meetings, flights, dinners. Not out of anxiety, but because it felt respectful. Right. I liked the quiet before things began, the stillness before everyone else arrived. I realized that what I'd once found strange about him had somehow become part of me. His small, deliberate habits had settled quietly into my own life: the way I folded shirts, wiped the windshield at gas stations, checked locks twice before bed. Little rituals that meant something only because they were done without needing to explain why. And then, one day, he was gone. No long illness, no warning, just gone, the way he'd lived without fuss. I remember the funeral being on a cold morning in February. People filled the chapel, and as the minister spoke, I kept glancing at the clock above the pulpit. It was 4 minutes slow. I don't know why that caught me off guard, but it did. For a second, I thought how much he would have noticed that too. When I came home that evening, the first thing I did was step into the kitchen. The clock was still there, still ticking, still for minutes fast. The same steady rhythm, the same quiet hum of his presence filling the room. I stood there for a long time watching it, and for the first time, I thought maybe that was his way of giving us time. Not more time than we had, just enough to prepare, to breathe, to live a little ahead of the moment. After my father's funeral, I found myself glancing at every clock I passed. In grocery stores, at the bank, in waiting rooms. They all seemed too precise, too self-assured. I caught myself wondering if any of them were wrong just a little. I began to understand that my father's clock wasn't really wrong at all. It was simply deliberate. Like him, he had lived 4 minutes ahead, and somehow we all did too. The house felt different without him. Still tidy, still warm, but quieter in a way that sound couldn't fix. The ticking from the kitchen seemed louder than ever. Every morning, when I made coffee, it felt like the clock filled in the silence he used to occupy. It didn't comfort me at first. It felt like a reminder that time was still moving, even if he wasn't. Mum never mentioned taking it down, and neither did I. She still cooked by it, still called people to dinner when it said 6 o'clock, even though it was really 5:56. Once, I tried asking her why she never corrected it. She just looked up from the cutting board, her hand still moving, and said, "Why would I?" There was nothing else to say. The conversation ended there, like so many small ones we never had to finish. I started visiting every Sunday after church. Mum and I didn't talk much about Dad. We didn't need to. We spoke about the neighbors, the yard, the repairs that never got done. But the clock kept talking for us its steady tick like a voice that wouldn't fade. One afternoon, as we sat with coffee between us, I realized the sunlight hit the wall just the same way it used to when he read the paper. The same slant across the kitchen table, the same warmth. For a moment, I almost expected to see him there, adjusting his watch, pretending not to notice the time. That was when I noticed something new. The clock wasn't just 4 minutes fast anymore. It was 6. I thought maybe the mechanism was finally giving out. I stood on a chair and checked the battery. It was fine. I adjusted the dial gently back to its rightful place, still for minutes ahead, just as it had been my whole life. But when I stepped down, something felt wrong. The ticking didn't sound right anymore. It was quieter, hesitant, like it was thinking about each second before letting it pass. That night, I dreamed of my father. He was standing by the kitchen doorway, same grey cardigan, same easy posture. He didn't speak, just looked at me, then at the clock. And though his mouth didn't move, I swear I heard the words clear as anything. Leave it. When I woke up, I went downstairs, half embarrassed at myself, and turned the dial back. 6 minutes ahead now. The ticking steadied immediately, the sound filling the house again. Mum didn't say a thing. She just smiled when she passed through the kitchen as if she knew. After that, I stopped checking my watch. I stopped worrying about catching trains or meetings or appointments to the minute. I started showing up early again sometimes 6 minutes ahead, just like he always did. And the strangest part, life began to feel a little easier. Waiting wasn't wasted time anymore. It became a pause I didn't know I'd been missing. One Sunday, I found Mum sitting at the table with the clock taken down beside her. She was polishing the glass, her fingers tracing the edge of it like she was touching a memory. "It's still running," I said softly. "I know," she replied. "I just wanted to clean it before it stops." She looked so small that day, like time had caught up to her all at once. I didn't know what to say, so I just sat down and watched her work. That evening, I hung it back on the wall. She thanked me, though I hadn't really done anything. We sat there a while longer, listening to it tick, each of us somewhere between the past and the present. There was something steadying about that sound, something real, like a heartbeat the house had borrowed from him. A few weeks later, when she passed quietly in her sleep, the house fell silent again. I stayed that night, too restless to leave. Around midnight, I walked into the kitchen. The clock was still ticking, but I could feel it slowing. I stood there for a long time, my hand resting on the frame, waiting for it to stop. It never did. It just kept going, steady and sure, for minutes fast. I smiled, because of course it did. It was still keeping his time. When I finally packed up the house, I took it down for the first time in decades. I wrapped it in an old towel, placed it in the front seat beside me, and drove home in silence. I didn't hang it right away. It sat on my desk for days, maybe weeks. Every time I looked at it, I thought about how strange it is, the way people leave pieces of themselves behind. Sometimes it's in words, sometimes in photographs. For him, it was in minutes. Eventually, I hung it in my own kitchen. It looked smaller there, humbler somehow. But when it started ticking again, the sound filled the room the same way it used to. My wife noticed almost immediately. "Your clock's fast," she said one morning, smiling. I just nodded. "I know." It took me almost a year to stop expecting my parents' house to call me back. For months, I'd catch myself driving their way on Sunday mornings, only to turn around halfway there. Sometimes I'd park by the old market, buy a cup of coffee, and sit in silence. I suppose that's the way grief works. It doesn't shout. It ticks. At home, the clock had already taken its place on our kitchen wall. The first morning after I hung it, I woke to the sound of its steady rhythm and felt something in the air familiar and foreign at once. My wife noticed it too. She said the ticking made her feel less alone when I was out. That made me smile. I told her she wasn't supposed to feel anything from it, it was just a clock. But the truth was, I knew exactly what she meant. Our son was still little then, 4 or 5 at most. He liked to stand on a chair and stare at the clock as if it were alive. Once he asked why it was faster than the one on the stove. I started to explain how it worked, but halfway through, I stopped. I realized I didn't want to give him a technical answer. So I said, that's just how it's always been. It helps us stay ready. He accepted it easily, like children do when they sense that something has meaning beyond the words. Years passed, quietly but quickly. The house filled with movement backpacks by the door, cereal bowls clinking, shoes scattered in pairs and singles. The clock watched it all, faithful and tireless. Mornings, we'd rush out the door. Evenings, we'd sit beneath it again, the same soft ticking marking the space between conversation and quiet. I never corrected it. It stayed 4 minutes fast, just like always. It became one of those things you don't question, like why the front door sticks in summer or why the porch light flickers in rain. Some things simply belong that way. When my son turned 12, he started timing everything. His homework, his showers, his morning routine. He liked precision, certainty. One day, I came home to find the kitchen chair pulled to the counter and the clock taken down. My stomach turned before I even saw him. He had the back panel open, screwdriver in hand, the same determined look I must have worn at his age. For a moment, I almost said his name too sharply. Then I stopped myself. He looked up and said, "Dad, did you know this is for minutes fast?" I smiled, the way my father once had, and said quietly, "Yeah, leave it." He frowned, confused. "But it's wrong." "Maybe," I said, "but it's the right kind of wrong." I helped him hang it back up, straightened it, and stepped down from the chair. He still didn't understand, but one day, he would. That night, as I sat alone at the table after everyone had gone to bed, I stared at the clock and realized how deeply its sound had worked itself into me. That faint rhythm was the measure of our lives' birthdays, dinners, holidays, small arguments, soft apologies. All of it ticked through that clock. It didn't just count time, it kept it like a promise. Years later, when my son was preparing to leave for college, I found him in the kitchen one morning. He had a new digital watch on his wrist, sleek and silent. "You'll be early for everything," I joked. He laughed. "That's the idea." Then, without thinking, I looked at the wall. The clock still ran ahead, ticking faithfully, as if it too were seeing him off. "You know," I said, "you could take it with you." He looked at it for a long time. "Nah," he said finally, "I like knowing it's here." Then he added, half smiling, "Besides, you'd probably still check it every morning." He was right. After he left, the house grew quieter again. The ticking became more noticeable, more personal. It filled the spaces where voices used to be. I started catching myself talking to it, sometimes small things like, "We ray early again," or "You ray still hanging in there, huh?" It wasn't crazy, not really. It just made sense that something that had marked so many lives might understand silence too. One evening, after a long day, I noticed it had stopped. Dead still. I felt a small ache, like I'd lost someone again. I took it down gently, laid it on the counter, and replaced the battery. The second hand twitched once, then began to move again, steady as ever. I stood there for a long time, watching it. That tiny motion, that faithful rhythm, it was like the house had exhaled. It's funny, the things that last. Not the big gestures, not the grand plans, but the small consistencies we never think about. The smell of coffee in the morning. The way sunlight hits a certain spot on the wall. The sound of a clock running 4 minutes fast. That night, I sat with a pen and paper and wrote down a few words, not for anyone in particular, but just to leave something behind, something that might explain without explaining. I folded the paper and taped it to the back of the clock. On it, I wrote, 4 minutes ahead. Not to rush, just to have time to breathe. Years passed, and the clock kept its steady rhythm. Houses changed, walls were repainted, people came and went, but the sound of that quiet ticking never really left the air. It was a kind of heartbeat, one that belonged to no one and everyone at once. The hands kept moving, always 4 minutes ahead, as if holding on to some secret reason only time itself remembered. When I grew old, I moved slower than I used to. My hair turned grey, my hearing faded, and sometimes I found myself staring at that same clock without realizing how long I'd been standing there. My wife passed first. The house emptied out again, just as it had so many times before. And through it all, that faithful sound stayed steady, patient, unbothered by the years. I used to think I'd outlive it. I didn't. The morning I felt my heart flutter the way my father's once had, I knew it was almost time. I sat at the kitchen table, watching the sunlight crawl up the wall, and listened to the seconds passing. 4 minutes ahead. That's where I'd always been, just like him. It wasn't much, but it was something, a cushion between now and what comes next. When they found me later, the clock was still ticking. My son, now grown with children of his own, came to clean the house. He moved slowly through the rooms, careful not to disturb too much. The kitchen looked smaller to him, but the clock still hung in the same place. He stood there for a while, remembering breakfasts, late-night talks, the smell of coffee, the way I'd always smiled at being early. He didn't touch it at first. He just listened. Eventually, he climbed on a chair to take it down. As he did, a small piece of folded paper fell from the back and landed on the floor. He opened it carefully, his thumb tracing the handwriting he hadn't seen in years. My handwriting. 4 minutes ahead. Not to rush, just to have time to breathe. He read it twice. Then he smiled, the kind of small, private smile that carries both understanding and ache. He ran a hand over the frame, replaced the note exactly as it had been, and hung the clock back on the wall. When he brought his family to visit a few weeks later, his daughter, no more than 7, noticed the ticking. "Daddy," she said, "the clock's wrong." He laughed softly, the same way I once had, and told her, maybe. But sometimes being a little ahead helps you catch the best parts of life. From that day on, the clock became part of their mornings too. It hung in a new kitchen now, over a different table, but its sound carried the same calm authority. The years kept folding themselves neatly around its rhythm. Birthdays, holidays, quiet Sundays, it was there for all of them. Sometimes, when the little girl would stand on a chair and watch the hands move, she'd ask her mother if she could fix it. And her mother, who had heard the story too many times to count, would just smile and say, "No, sweetheart, that's how it's supposed to be." And so it stayed, decade after decade. The kitchen changed color, the wallpaper faded, the light bulbs were replaced, but the clock never stopped. Its gentle tick outlasted everyone who ever said it, watched it, or relied on it. And somehow, in the hum of everyday life, in the clinking of dishes, the laughter after dinner, the quiet moments before bed, it still spoke. Not in words, but in rhythm. The rhythm of care, of patience, of love, measured not in minutes, but in moments. Maybe one day it'll stop for good. Maybe the battery will finally give out and no one will think to replace it. Maybe it'll end up in a box, buried under old photographs and yellowed recipes. But until then, it keeps going faithful, soft, for minutes ahead. And maybe that's the real legacy, not the clock itself, but the lesson it carried. That life isn't about catching up to time. It's about having enough of it to notice the way sunlight hits a wall, the sound of someone's laughter before dinner, or the warmth of knowing you were never late for the things that truly mattered. Sometimes I imagine someone finding that clock decades from now, long after my family's gone. They'll hang it somewhere new, unaware of its story, puzzled that it doesn't match the rest. They'll glance up, check their watch, and realize it's 4 minutes fast. Maybe they'll leave it that way. And if they do, then the quiet rhythm of all those who came before my father, my mother, myself will keep on ticking, gently ahead of the world, giving someone else just enough time to breathe. If this story reminded you of someone, or of something you still keep, maybe a sound, a habit, a small piece of time, tell us in the comments below. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, give this video a like and subscribe. It helps keep the memories ticking just a little bit ahead.